Hello there, and thanks for listening. This is Dr. Joshua Goldenberg. I am a registered naturopathic doctor here in the wonderful state of Colorado, practicing naturopathic medicine in Colorado Springs, just about an hour south of Denver. So, today we're going to talk about probiotics. This is our Probiotics 101 class, and I'm quite excited to talk about it. It's an area of intense interest of mine. I kind of cut my teeth in the research world on probiotics with a Cochrane Review on probiotics many years ago now, and have continued to do research on probiotics over the years. And of course, clinically, I use probiotics all the time in practice. My practice focuses on gut health in particular, and so of course it makes a lot of sense. Although what we'll learn in this talk is that probiotics are not just for the gut, which is actually quite fascinating. Okay, so if you don't know me, just a little bit about me. I like to wear many, many different hats. It keeps me interested. I've always kind of been that way. So the three primary hats I wear are a researcher. I'm a research investigator for Bastyr University up in Seattle, which is where I came from. My wife and I moved pretty recently from Seattle. I was a research faculty up there and continue to be so. And I am as I said, a clinician and naturopathic doctor registered here in Colorado State. And I am a faculty and professor of mostly evidence-based medicine, which is a form of medicine that basically tries to follow the research as best it can. And I have taught for Bastyr. Now I teach for AIHM, which is a fellowship program for MDs, DOs, NPs, chiropractors, etc. And I teach them how to critically evaluate research and apply it to their patients. I've been lucky enough in that a lot of our research has actually been very well received in the lay media. We've been interviewed, our research team and myself have been interviewed by Fox News, we've been in BBC, Prevention Magazine, etc. And we've had some high-profile scientific papers as well, including in the Cochrane Library and JAMA, which is the main journal of the American Medical Association. And I'm happy to announce, too, that as of about a month ago, I am a young investigator awardee, mentee at the Rome Foundation, which is the main international foundation for IBS and other functional bowel diseases. Okay, so what are probiotics? So there have been so many different definitions given for probiotics, and there's no perfect one, but the one that's most commonly used is by the World Health Organization, the WHO, which basically says probiotics are live microorganisms that are consumed for health benefit. Okay, so we can see right away a few things. One, they're microorganisms. This is going to include, of course, yeast and bacteria and arguably viruses, but probably not on this definition. And also, of course, they have to be live. That is somewhat debatable, as we're going to see in some of the future slides, and then consumed for health benefits. So basically, these are taken in not for food, so of course we know like yogurt has probiotics in it, and people eat yogurt as a food. So at least with this definition, it's not going to be considered a probiotic, but of course if you use yogurt to help your health, then all of a sudden it's considered a probiotic. So it's an interesting definition. It's not perfect, but it's kind of the best we have. Now this little gentleman here, he's a Nobel laureate from the early 1900s, and he is one of the very, very famous scientist, actually, sort of the father of lots of branches in immunology as well. But he was the first, at least on record that we know of, to really begin to identify the health benefits of these particular microorganisms. Interestingly, he first thought about it when he was looking at Bulgarian peasants who were living very, very long lives. And he presumed, or his hypothesis was, that this was because of the fermented yogurt, the fermented dairy product that they consumed, and it was the live organisms in there that were conferring benefits. So we can see, of course, people forever have been eating fermented foods of one sort or another, whether or not they knew it was for health benefits, and lots of cultures probably did know they were for health benefits, and every culture kind of has their own fermented foods that have become ingrained in their culture, which is quite interesting in my mind. And one of the things that we'll have to do future talks on is how to make some of these foods. I really enjoy that. I love having my my kitchen counter be a mess of experiments of bubbling concoctions, making, whether it's sauerkraut or tempeh or any of the wonderful different or yogurt, any of the wonderful different fermented food items that there are. Okay, so just some quick background here. What is where do the probiotics go? So if you've gone to any of my other presentations, I give a talk on the gut microbiota, so we're not going to get too far into it right now. But basically, we have a huge amount of microorganisms within us and also on us. Depending on the research paper you're reading, anywhere from 2 to 1 to 10 to 1 we are more bacteria than we are human, at least from a cell count perspective, and also from genetic material, certainly as well. So they make up a huge part of who we are. It kind of has changed the way we think about ourselves as humans. We're beginning to realize that we are actually what some people call superorganisms. In other words, we're a symbiotic relationship. They do a huge amount of things for us, anywhere from training our immune system to defending us from invaders, to even making vitamins for us. And that's a whole nother talk. But basically, they're extremely important. They live everywhere, but in largest numbers in the large intestine over here. And so this is where we think, at least for the most part, when we're using probiotics, this is where they're going to act. Now, that is not completely true, and we'll talk about some caveats there in a second. But at least it gives you a little bit of a sense of where in the body we're talking about, where there already are microorganisms, and where we're going to be introducing more microorganisms when we use probiotics. Now up here on the right here is a beautiful micrograph. We have the citation right there below on the right. What you see here on the bottom part is the blue stain. That is the colonocytes. Those are the colon cells. Then we have this gorgeous picture of the mucus layer, this green line in between, separating the sort of sacred space of the colon cells from inside the colon, where you have a whole mess of different organisms and bacteria. And that's what all that kind of looks like, sprinkles or jimmies. That is a whole host of many different species of microorganisms. That is a up close and personal picture of the gut microbiota and where it is as far as real estate is concerned. And quite interestingly, in certain disease states, we see that this mucus layer is a lot thinner, and then you have more interaction between the gut microbiota and the human colonocytes or the colon cells, and that causes problems, but that's a little bit of a tangent, so we won't go there. But this is basically what we're talking about. This is where the gut microbiota is, and this is where we're going to, for the most part, be affecting change when we use probiotics. Okay, so where do you get your probiotics? How do you get them into your body? So probably the one that most people are comfortable with or familiar with when we think about probiotics, they might even think of a counter in a supplement store, right? They come in pill form, of course, right? So if you go to any health food store or even supermarkets, you have entire rows of counters devoted to probiotics, and there's so many different kinds, and we're going to kind of get into that in a second there. But so certainly you can take them orally, you can take them in pill form. We're going to talk a little bit later about how to make sure that you get nice healthy ones and ones that are actually going to do something. But of course, they don't come from pill trees, right? They come from fermented foods, primarily is how we get them in the diet. On the bottom right here, we have a picture of people preparing kimchi, which is a traditional fermented dish. Of course, there's sauerkrauts and millions of other traditional fermented foods as well. So you can get your probiotics in through supplement pill forms or powder forms. You can get them in through fermented foods. This is less pleasant to talk about, but if you're following the news at all lately, probably the biggest thing to happen in medicine in a very long time are things called FMTs, or fecal microbial transplants, and we'll probably do a video on that in the future. But basically what this is taking stool from a healthy donor and administering it to someone who's not healthy. Now, this can be done via colonoscopy in the gastroenterologist's office. It could be done via endoscopy and upper endoscopy, where it's introduced through the mouth. They scope it all the way down into the small intestines, and it's introduced there. Now they're even developing pills of it that are, triple encapsulated, so they're not going to open up in your mouth or anything. That's a little gross. But they're very, very often also administered via enemas, right? So there's a little picture of an enema, fleet enema here. Basically, it's one way to administer it directly into the rectum. And so now just be aware, this the FDA is very strict on this, so this should really only be done under the supervision of your doctor, and these days it's really only done for recurrent C. diff infections. But this is one way you might introduce probiotics, and again, so we're using live microorganisms, but from the stool of a healthy donor is how we get them, and administering them for health benefit. So this is arguably one way of getting probiotics. There are vaginal suppositories. There's also rectal suppositories too. And this is often used for women that have vaginal infections, let's say, or bacterial overgrowth, bacterial vaginosis, where you basically have an overgrowth of the wrong type of bacteria, and so you try to bring that part of the body back into balance by using suppositories of probiotics. So that's one way of administering them as well. And then, of course, you can imbibe them as beverages. So, kombucha is a very famous one right now. You can't go to a grocery store and not see kombucha available. I have yet to try to make my own kombucha, although I hear it's not too hard. So that'll be my next thing. My sister actually is quite accomplished at it. She made all of her own kombucha for her wedding, so I have to get her recipe. But anyway, I digress. So there's many different ways and sources of getting probiotics into the body. Okay, so just for fun, there's a lot of common fermented foods out there, and people ask, okay, so what type of probiotics does it deliver? So this is sort of a collection. I've put together some of the more common ones. Sauerkraut's a fascinating one. If you've never made a fermented food, sauerkraut's a great one to start with because it's really simple. You simply take cabbage that ideally it's organic without pesticides, and you basically chop it up and mash it in your hands as you add salt. And that's pretty much it. The salt extracts the water, the liquid from within the cabbage, and you get this nice soppy mix. The salt retards the growth of pathogenic bacteria, and it basically just allows for the growth of lactic acid organisms that, guess what, are already living on the cabbage. That's what's so cool. So the cabbage comes with its own probiotics that you're now allowing to grow and multiply and proliferate and ferment, and that's what you get, a week or so later when you actually eat sauerkraut, and that nice sour taste comes from these organisms that are producing acid, basically. So it's really quite fascinating. Easy one to make. Kefir or kefir, depending on how you pronounce it, is also a very easy one to make. This has also yeast in it too, so both bacteria and yeast, and that's a fun one to make out of dairy. Yogurt is also a fascinating one, easy to make. The trick with that is to really get the right temperature. So if you've got a warm kitchen, that'll work well, but they also sell these sort of heating pads to make yogurt, and that's an easy one. And then tempeh is the one that I've been most frustrated with. I think I've tried it maybe 8 times and have been successful twice. It's, at least in my experience, it's very fickle fermented food to make. If you've got any tips, please let me know. But this is a particular single organism, Rhizopus oligosporus, the bane of my existence, that actually ferments soybeans and makes this really delicious, nutty flavored tempeh. And then, of course, everyone's familiar with wine and beer. We could not have that without fermentation. That is, of course, how you make wine and beer. It's fermented grapes or fermented barley or other grain products. Now, however, what's interesting is the yeasts are removed. This is yeast in both cases. These are removed in the finished product. So many people ask me, so if I drink more wine, I get my probiotics, right? Not quite. Those are removed in the settling phase when you make wine. That's also a really fun thing to do if you've ever made wine. I'm in the middle of a batch right now with my father-in-law. There's a stage, you introduce the yeast to the juice, the grape juice, and then it kind of does its job, and then the yeast settles down to the bottom, and you basically extract, you take the liquid off the top and basically remove the yeast that way. Now, there are fancy ways of making wine. Oh, I'm going to mispronounce this. I think it's called on the lease or something like that, alis. which is a traditional way of making wine where you basically leave the wine in contact with the dead yeast a little bit longer, and it takes up some really cool flavors from the yeast that way. Now, there's also a very, very cool way to do this. So, winemakers these days, and the same with beer, winemakers these days are very, very cautious with which yeast strain they use to make their wine because they want to have complete control over their winemaking process, which of course makes sense. But traditionally, that's not how it was done. There's just like with the sauerkraut, the cabbage, and the lactic acid organisms, the grapes themselves have wild yeast that grows on the skin. And as soon as you crush the grapes or open up the grapes and the juice spills out, that's a sugar source for that yeast, and they immediately start fermenting it. And that is wild fermented wine, basically making wine based off of the wild yeast that grows with the grapes. Fascinating. It's more variable, of course, because it'll change depending on where you are and which yeast is growing on it at that time in that location. But there actually are wineries that devote to just wild fermentation. My wife and I moved from Seattle, actually from Woodinville, which is a wine town, and they actually had a couple wineries there that only did wild fermented wine. So you might see that out there in the store. But again, I digress. As you can tell, I'm quite excited about this kind of stuff. I think it's very fascinating, and I really do love it. Okay, so how do these probiotics work? So we talked about how you get them in and how we define them and what they are, but how do they work? The honest answer is we don't really fully know. We know that they do work from numerous research studies, and we'll talk about some of those in a second, but how do they actually work? Now, it'll depend on what you're using it for, what disease you're using it for, and of course there's different theories, and we haven't really proven them. But the going ones are as follows. One is the real estate theory. So, for example, I cut my teeth on research using probiotics to prevent pediatric antibiotic-associated diarrhea, or also antibiotic-associated C. diff diarrhea, which is a really nasty disease to have, infection to have. So basically that happens there is that people take antibiotics for whatever reason, they have some sort of infection, and in a certain percentage of people, what that does is that clears, they are antibiotic, they kill biotics. Now they kill the bad bacteria that you're trying to kill, but on their way in, they also go through the colon and clear out entire areas of real estate in the colon. And the theory is that now you've opened up real estate for pathogenic bacteria to take a hold, right? It's almost like you have a garden and you just bulldoze a strip through the garden. The first thing that's going to pop up are not your flowers, they're going to be the weeds, right? The weeds were just kind of sitting there in seed form or with bacteria in spore form, waiting for an opportunity, and now they have it, and then that's what you see. So it's kind of the same. So the idea is with probiotics, if you have bulldozed through part of your garden, part of your gut, say you took antibiotics or you had some other form of dysbiosis, the idea is if we take probiotics, perhaps what they're doing is just kind of holding space. They're holding that real estate. Basically, it's like you bulldoze through the garden, but then you broadcast wildflowers, right? And so that was the first thing to pop up, and that was holding the space from the other weeds. That's one theory. The other theory is many bacteria will actually produce their own antibiotics. It's really kind of cool. And they'll release that antibiotic around them that'll oftentimes be specific to pathogenic bacteria. So the bacteria, the probiotics themselves, you eat them or you take them in some form, they establish themselves, and then they produce their own antibiotics that seem to be specific to these pathogens, and so they may be working that way in certain disorders. They also may be training the immune system. So we know that probiotics have this delicate dance, this chemical conversation with the immune system. We saw that picture where you had colon cells and then also the bacteria separated by that mucus layer. Well, there's constant crosstalk between those healthy bacteria and the immune system that hangs out with the colon cells, right? And sometimes they go ahead and taste up into the colon to make sure everything's copacetic. But basically the idea is that healthy probiotics may be training the immune system or triggering the immune system in some healthy way. So they may be working via triggering the immune system. There's a fascinating case we're going to talk about in a few slides, where probiotics actually help prevent colds and flus or even treat colds. And the big question is, how in the world could that work? We're talking about a respiratory system here, and you eat probiotics or you swallow probiotics, and that's in the GI system. They're not connected. Well, the answer is they are connected via the immune system. So the thought is that the probiotics are triggering the immune system in some way, and then the immune system travels through the blood and gets to the lungs and does its job there. So that may be another way that probiotics work. And then also they produce lots of byproducts, right? So lots of chemical byproducts. Now those themselves may be really beneficial to the colon cells, to the body. So for example, with colitis, I deal with a lot of colitis, ulcerative colitis, and things. We know that butyrate is very healthy for folks that have ulcerative colitis. It can really help. There's actually medicines that are just butyrate, enemas, but certain probiotics will produce their own butyrate. So it could be that they themselves aren't benefiting the disease, they're not helping the patient through the disease, but it's what they produce, their byproducts that are benefiting the patient. So that's another possibility.